More than a year after promising action, the government's finally revealed its answer to high and rising power prices. But the response from businesses has been tepid at best. The costs are weighing on companies and consumers alike, and the political parties are clearly amping up for next year's election campaign.
Bold, urgent change is required.
Manufacturing is imperilled. We're running the risk of the Rust Belt.
All we're seeing is tinkering around the edges.
Kia ora, ko Russell Palmer aho, ānei te pūrongo tōrangapū mō tēnei wiki. Welcome to Focus on Politics. The government has been under massive pressure over the cost of living, and power prices are playing a big part. Stats NZ estimates electricity costs up 11% in the year to July, more than double the increase for food.
Really expensive, yeah, they keep going up. It's like every time you get a new bill every month, it gets worse and worse and worse.
They're too high. We need to think of a different way of doing it to make it more sustainable.
I feel like they've been going steadily up, especially in a household of two. We're pushing over $200 a month at the moment.
Also costly for businesses. The major electricity users group represents manufacturers, supermarkets, data centres and the like. Its chair, John Harbord, gives the lay of the land.
We saw a number of companies closing last year. Winstone Pulp obviously closed permanently. OG Fibre Solutions have closed a number of their operations. And right across the board, we've seen companies either closing for a short-term basis or reducing their production.
So last year, the government commissioned a review from global consultancy Frontier Economics. Its report, finally released this Wednesday, identifies the key problem as a shortage of firming, essentially backup generation for when the weather's dry and hydro lakes are low.
There is no silver bullet, but bold, urgent change is required and needed across several areas to manage the dry year problem.
The Energy Minister Simon Watt's promising bold, urgent change. His solution has two main components. First, seeking an investor for a liquid natural gas or LNG importing station so it can be shipped in from overseas, but still quite a few decisions to be made.
In December, Cabinet will determine the best way forward, including confirming if LNG is the most appropriate additional source of fuel for New Zealand.
The second key aspect comes in the form of a letter. The Finance Minister, Nicola Willis, has sent a message quite literally to the big power generation and retail companies Mercury, Genesis and Meridian.
Independent review we commissioned highlighted that these majority government-owned companies may have in the past been prevented from investments in larger generation projects because of a perception that the Crown would not provide capital funding or equity injections to support them.
She says the government is making clear it will support such projects. Here's Meridian's Chief Executive, Mike Rowan.
So we haven't had a problem raising capital, and in fact that's the piece that we said was bold. We think it shows the government is trying to test whether its ownership of us is holding us back. It's enabled us to look at our projects and go, can we be bolder?
The Electricity Authority will also get similar powers to the Commerce Commission, and the government will work with power companies to cut regulatory barriers. The ministers have high hopes.
This package of announcements will deliver.
That the lights appear to have dimmed, which could be New Zealand's energy future if we don't make the changes we're proposing today.
We're confident this package will deliver the outcomes.
But is it as bold and urgent as is required?
No, it's not bold.
That's Alan MacDonald from the EMA, New Zealand's largest business association. He says other things could help in the short term.
Get some more gas on stream or get it into the country quicker. By looking at the boat option, that will be expensive, but it will give some more certainty in there, putting something solid into the terminal that they're talking about. So at this stage, they're just asking for expressions of interest or going out to procurement. Well, there could have been some solid backing behind that. But again, government's not always the answer. Everybody tends to stick their hand out and there isn't any money in the kitty. So it's not surprising that that hasn't happened. I think Labor getting its opposition to gas exploration off the table would be useful. It would just send a positive signal that might just reassure people looking at that longer term, but would give some short-term relief.
And here's John Harbord again from the major electricity users group.
See some good things in there around reducing our over-reliance on the weather and incentivising the build of new generation. Hopefully that will lead to lower prices over time, but there's nothing in this that's going to make a difference to affordability over the next decade.
Some are more optimistic. Business New Zealand's Energy Council welcomes the government's positive steps and points to similarities in its own plan. All in all, though, it is mostly consultation, taking proposals, letting the market lead, and neither the Minister nor Meridian could say when it might mean lower prices. Underwhelming was the broad response. Remember, the report itself was commissioned last August, more than a year before the announcement. At the time, the Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, said his government was one of action.
There's no doubt about it. We have an energy security crisis. We're making an intervention about that, and we shouldn't be in this position what we are. We now own it, we've got to fix it, and that's what we're doing.
The Cabinet had committed to act with urgency to reverse the oil and gas ban by 2025, eventually delayed to the end of July. Regulations were also cut for lines companies, for building an LNG import facility, and for market regulation, and more water is now allowed to be drawn from hydro lakes in emergencies. Fast forward to this week, the Prime Minister's not changing course.
It's a sum of lots of little things that are going to add up to make a big difference, to make sure that we've got affordable, abundant electricity for New Zealand in the future.
Asked why this week's actions couldn't have been taken a year ago, Nicola Willis pleads ignorance.
The Frontier report was what made explicit to us that this was a potential constraint.
The business sector voices are some of the same who gave a scathing assessment of the government in the mood of the boardroom last week, traditionally some of National's biggest supporters. The Auckland Business Chamber, led by former National Party leader Simon Bridges, says the problem is not with what's in the plan, but what's left out. It doesn't do enough to address the root causes. The ministers are clear about what they think those are.
Because of Labour's policies, households and businesses have been paying the price.
Gentailers looking to invest in firming capacity, by which we mean large hydro schemes, coal schemes, gas schemes, geothermal schemes. There have been real questions about whether the government would actually sign off on all of those investments. It had an explicit goal of 100% renewable.
The EMA agrees the ban was short-sighted, but
there are other things. We've got the deindustrialisation going on. We've got higher prices. We've got skill shortages. There's been a lack of investment in new tech over an extended period of time. Just as an example, a few years ago, the Whakatane mill shut down. It's about 130-odd jobs involved. An overseas investor came in, refocused the business, invested in the new tech, and rehired about 140 people.
Labour's Megan Woods says more than halfway through its term, the government needs to start taking responsibility.
Look, I think there's some really practical things that the government could have been starting tomorrow. Things like putting solar on our schools to increase generation ahead of next winter. We're currently using gas that could be used by our manufacturers and protecting jobs to heat our schools when there's obvious alternatives there. We could also be using the power of the way in which the government buys its electricity to stimulate new generation. But Simon Watts today said they'd look at it. Just get on with it and do it. We don't have the time to waste. We've got a government that's already sat on its hands through 2 tight winters. They were promising us fundamental reform, but all we're seeing is tinkering around the edges.
And the Green Party MP, Scott Willis, says the state needs to take a stronger role.
We need to boost our renewable capacities. Doesn't need to be Onslow, can be smaller scale pump storage. Those types of options aren't in this. There's nothing there. But those are things that we should be considering. So the solution that we're talking about is, as we've always said, we think the state needs to be involved and the state needs to invest in the generation and storage through a state business.
The unions want to go even further and have the government buy back all the gentailers with the dividends they provide. Nationalising or breaking up the power companies were also ideas recently floated by New Zealand First's deputy Shane Jones. He has been highly unimpressed by the market-led status quo thus far, saying this at the party's recent AGM.
The campaign that I will run on behalf of New Zealand First Party will not only be Trumpian, you'll hear about it in Australia.
Shane Jones's name was attached to earlier documentation, but nowhere to be seen in the revelation on Wednesday. His only appearance that day on the platform did not reveal much. Cabinet collective responsibility rules limit his ability to speak against a government position.
As we move forward to the next election, then obviously each party will give greater clarity for the public as to what they think should happen. Now, no one listening to your show has any doubt that I believe that manufacturing is imperiled. We're running the risk of the Rust Belt.
Since then, he's been uncharacteristically quiet, perhaps keeping his powder dry. The opposite approach would be selling off all the government's shares in the gentailers, a solution proposed by the Frontier Report. It has its fans, like the ACT Party's Simon Court.
Well, that might make sense. And when we think about the enormous infrastructure deficit that has opened up around transport and health and other really vital services that the government needs to provide, it looks sensible.
But he's also bound by cabinet rules and says further divestment would be a decision for a future government. The business groups are also less keen, saying it would cause disruption and uncertainty, which Ellen McDonald says is exactly what they were hoping to avoid.
The thing that business really was looking for in this report, or from the recommendations and government's reaction, was some kind of certainty around both supply and pricing, and I don't think we got either of those in the short term.
All up, the government took on just 2 of the Frontier Report's 10 main recommendations. Things like setting up a Crown entity to lead the firming strategy, consolidating the lines companies, and removing electricity from the emissions trading scheme, all left by the wayside. Groups like the EMA say many of those suggestions were simply never going to fly because of the political or market conditions. The Commerce Commission's approval for a 600,000-tonne stockpile of coal for the Huntly Power Station in case of dry years and the LNG import decision do both offer firming solutions to the dry year problem, but not everyone's convinced, including the retired public servant Judith Aitken, who once worked for the former Ministry of Energy.
LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is given by the Minister as the answer to everything that we need, and what they're waiting on now is tenders for installation of facilities. By all the recent research on that, LNG is about 33% worse than coal in its planet-warming emissions. It's not a good investment.
The cost to the climate and to taxpayers through international commitments and the ETS may make fossil fuels a pricey approach. Climate protest group 350 Aotearoa says Frontier was constrained by terms of reference that make no mention of the climate or the government's goal of doubling renewable generation, instead referring vaguely to current and future demand. It also conflicts with Minister Watts' comments in February when he warned the coming winter could be tough.
We had a very clear conversation with the group that is undertaking that review, which are international experts, that we need to leave no stone unturned in the context of that review. And Minister Jones and I are both working jointly to ensure that we ensure that review actually delivers tangible outcomes that we can use and inform us going forward.
And commentators like the University of Waikato hydrologist and energy researcher Earl Bardsley say the Frontier Report and the government's solutions are too dependent on oil.
Now that's fine as far as it's concerned in producing power, but that power is going to be expensive. You're not going to be able to lower the costs of electricity in dry years by using expensive imported gas or imported coal.
Mr Bardsley came up with the Lake Onslow pumped hydro project Labour looked at last term. He says we cannot rely on our current hydro lakes alone.
We don't have all that much energy storage within the lakes. So the problem is that you might install a whole lot of wind and solar and go into a dry period with the lakes at capacity because you've been using so much wind and solar. But then when the rivers flow go down, we're not going to be able to simply rely on that previous high level to take us through the dry years because the levels will fall away quickly anyway. And we can't rely on the wind blowing and the sun shining through the period of the dry years to offset that.
He says the Lake Onslow project would roughly double New Zealand's hydro capacity. The roughly $16 billion build cost is eye-watering, though.
We have to measure that against the national impact of not building the Onslow scheme. In other words, having to put up with high electricity prices in the long term and the economic impact that those high electricity prices would have on the economy.
Labour's Megan Woods says Labour's battery project was much more than just Lake Onslow, but with the election growing ever closer, Labour and its potential partners can be expected to have fresh policy in this area. RNZ's acting political editor Craig McCulloch says the National Party is in a bind.
New Zealand First has floated this idea of nationalisation. ACT, on the other hand, wants privatisation. And meanwhile, you've got the gentailers coming out saying they've actually already solved the problem, basically, with their 600,000-tonne coal stockpile at Huntly. Ultimately, given all of that, National seems to have judged that its collection of tweaks, what it has here, will be enough to solve the problem. However, it won't do anything for power prices in the short term, and so that's not going to help National very much in the polls.
And the government's promises could put it in a tricky financial position too.
The capital raise question for the gentailers, also around the LNG import facility, there could be quite significant sums attached to that, and that could be difficult when you think about the tight fiscal constraints that Nicola Willis is operating in, where secondly, she's going to have to explain to New Zealanders why taxpayers should have to pitch in when these gentailers are creaming huge profits and paying out big dividends.
The minister so far has avoided signalling direct support for those struggling to pay the bills. If the clash gives New Zealand First a few more votes at the left's expense, National won't be too upset. But with traditional supporters wanting more action and the cost of living hitting voters in the back pocket, energy can be expected to be a core election issue next year. That was Focus on Politics. I'm Russell Palmer. Thanks for joining us. Mā te wā.